And when I applied to the University of Chicago, it was 4% black. Okay? And at the time, that didn't concern me, right? Until I noticed by the time I got to maybe midpoint in my freshman year, I would pretty regularly leave my dorm, walk to class many times in the snow, sub-zero degrees, and very rarely would I ever see a face that mirrored my own. And initially, I wondered why I would have these feelings of loneliness and even, semi-depression. And, over time, I realized it was the lack of representation, right? So my challenges in college, they were not academic. Of course, I was challenged like everyone else, but the lack of representation, it really does have a mental toll on underrepresented students. And I think that that's the story that's not oftentimes told. I'll just leave it there.
Thank you. Seriously, thank you for sharing that. And I think what I wanted to sort of try and summarize and articulate clearly is that when we talk about the role race plays in college admission, we have to keep in mind that now there are, not all institutional priorities are affirmative action policies, but most affirmative action policies are institutional priorities. And so we're not talking about the elimination of affirmative action as an articulation of institutional priorities through this recent Supreme Court case. We're talking about race-conscious practices being eliminated and scrutinized. And so one of the things that we had hoped to do is just kind of dispel a few of the myths that kind of exist out there and make sure that we were articulating from our perspective where there's misperception, and I think for me that's the biggest one. I know when I talk to my students and they say, well, with affirmative action gone, what's that mean? I'm like, I don't know, but you sure are a heavily recruited water polo player for Harvard, so you let me know if you feel impacted by that at all. So I think, it's really making sure that we are not, again, conflating nomenclature and terminology.
So I do not have a spouse who's a lawyer, nor have I gone to law school. But I did listen to a podcast about this. I'm happy to share. There's 2 episodes on the New York Times podcast called The Daily that cover this. If anyone's listened to those episodes, can you raise your hand about affirmative action? Okay, cool. So a couple quick things that add on to what folks have very eloquently shared. So the original Supreme Court decision that allowed affirmative action to take place did not actually do so for the reason that it says on the website, though that was an effect of it that was supported by those who wrote in the concurring opinion. The reason that affirmative action, according to the Daily, was able to be passed was actually not as a correction to past wrongs. They didn't feel that there was quite a compelling enough way to show that. It was because it is like a form of free speech that you can allow the consideration of this one factor among many other factors. But that now that it has been overturned in the dissenting opinion, which I'm forgetting if this was from Ketanji Brown's or the other one that was written, but one of the arguments in favor of keeping it going would be that it does end up having that effect. And so that is a fair thing to say, but it's also good to know what Justice Roberts' opinion said and how it originally got passed. So then in Justice Roberts' explanation, and also in Clarence Thomas's concurring opinion for the majority, they were basically saying we do not believe that there is a compelling enough interest in allowing this form of free speech because it can inhibit others' free speech. Clarence Thomas also adds that in his personal experience, he went to mostly white college when he was younger, and he felt that as a black man, it permanently put a stigma on him, so that everywhere he went, he felt there was an asterisk on his accomplishments. So he has, for decades, wanted to undo some of this, largely from personal experience. Okay, so those are that. One of the interesting glimmers of hope that I find, and I'm glad that Chase mentioned that before, because there are certain paths that we can move forward in, and I know that's where we're going to go with this also, is what are we doing in our own work? is that you can still mention race in college admissions essays. So if it is relevant to a student's upbringing, they are encouraged to continue doing that. That part has not been banned. Okay, I think that's all I want to say for now.
I'd like to build off of Chris's point about being able to mention race in essays. Ultimately, I think we live in, and the phrase gets used so often that it sort of loses power, but the idea of people of color as marginal. And so the term that gets used so often is white supremacy, right? But I want to break that down. People of color as marginal or less than by default.
Wait,
And
say that again?
people of color as less than or marginal by default. And so I'm going to submit my essay, and I don't know, I'm still exploring this idea, but I'm going to submit my essay, and in my essay I will identify myself as a person of color. Wink, wink, nod, nod. You can still use, race-conscious admissions. My personal ministry is, I think in a perfect world, there would not need to be a sort of, initiatives to undo racial subordination, because there would not be racial subordination. And so I think the root of the problem, and Brian Rosenberg and I talked about this a little bit, part of the root of the problem is that there's residential segregation, there's inter and intra-school segregation in terms of academic tracking and people going to neighborhood schools that are vastly different in resources and competence. Occupational segregation, right? Lack of sort of cultural understanding in pockets, right? There's huge disparities in society, and I forgot which one of these brilliant people said it, but like, somehow it falls on college admissions officers to try to rectify all of that.
Right.
By admitting, who was it?
We were talking about that last
It was
time.
you. Like, all of a sudden, college admissions officers are going to overcome all of those structural problems by admitting a really tiny percentage of the population into a tiny percentage of colleges. And that's not at all the solution, right? I mean, it might be a tiny, around the margins, right? Yeah, infinitesimal. And I've been showing you guys this picture that I love with the little bubbles of, colleges, and it shows Harvard and Carolina, the range from Harvard to Carolina is this small, but then all the colleges are like, this big. And so really, like, when we think about racial consideration in college admissions, people are fighting over a really small percentage of the pie, right? But it's the percentage of the pie that everybody wants.
Yeah.
Right?
Well, and it has been shown, sorry, just to add, no, keep that in mind. Keep that in mind. It has been shown that if you go to a highly selective institution, you are X percentage points more likely to end up in the 1%.
Well, and you'll complete your degree. So that's the other thing.
And
There's getting into college is certainly one hurdle. Staying in and completing college is another one. And those highly selective schools, I'm at Carolina, there's a lot of support, there's...
We heard Alexis Redding tell us that there are a lot of supports and scaffolds here at Harvard to make sure that freshmen graduate within 6 years, 98%.
Yeah, and I think Carolina's right on up there, right at 98.
Because the resources are there, right? And so when you have a state-funded, publicly funded university, regional universities that don't have that, the students are left with a lot less. So we are talking about a larger segment of universities that students, could go to outside of this highly selective piece of it, but are the supports there for those students to actually persist and graduate? Or like Chris has seen with a lot of his students dropping out, and then we have a lot of people with some degree, some college with their degree, and that's a whole other issue, right?
Yeah.
But I'm sorry.
No, I think that's a great point, because they're fighting over these slots at schools that don't guarantee success, but they significantly increase your expectations for quality of life and career earning.
Just a quick addendum to what I said earlier. So one thing on the essay thing real quick. Sarah Lawrence College, on their one of their questions that you could choose to answer if you want to when you're applying this year is like, here's a snippet of Justice Roberts' decision. Here's a quote from it. Please tell us if this has impacted you in any way, shape, or form. Basically. So putting that out there. Second part, we mentioned the military thing, but I don't know that like we made this clear. So the representative from the military in the case said like, here's a compelling interest in why the military is like a national security issue, and we have to have a diverse like set of leaders in the military. And so that actually did make it into the decision. So affirmative action is still allowed for the military academies, but not for anybody else, which I think a logical, and it says explicitly that that's because they're training the next generation of American leaders in the military, which I feel like there's an easy like counter argument, which is like, aren't colleges doing the same thing?
Yeah. And I just want to point out too, and I'm sorry, because I was just like, this is actually why I love it, and this is why I love this group, and this is why I think this conversation is so important, because there's so much nomenclature out there, and I want to just point out, because I think you mean race-conscious admission practices, right, or yes. Race-conscious affirmative action, right? Yeah, yes. It's so well, yeah.
Because affirmative action could also be me.
Right.
Someone from a rural area applying to a school in Baltimore, Maryland, where they don't get a lot of kids from rural areas, and they don't get a lot of girls from rural areas. And there was one of me from Kansas at Goucher. But Goucher really likes to say that we have representation from all 50 states. And so I was not like stellar academically. I didn't get a 36 on my ACT. But they gave me a full ride because they wanted that additional perspective in their community. And there's lots of different ways that affirmative action can play out. And I just think that it's important for us to know that it can affect people in a lot of different ways that maybe aren't the ways that we think of. Maybe that's a misperception.
Yeah. Exactly, and that's, these conversations are so important. So I'm going to offer one, I'll offer a thought, and I know that we've got some questions, and then, of course, if anyone has anything else. I think what we're, and we've all talked about this, the observation that I've made is that we are yet again looking to the top 25 universities to be like the panacea of correction for 400 and some odd years of atrocious behavior, while at the same time saying that those institutions are only available to those who committed the atrocities historically in the past, right? That's complicated, right? We have really subjective understandings of merit, to use Chase's example. We have really subjective understandings of what it means to be successful, what neurotypical learning styles look like, for whom were any of these institutions built. Like all this stuff is kind of embedded into the thing, and each one of us plays a role in trying to correct course for the next generation of folks who we hope to see in these places, who we hope to have access to these places. And what race-conscious admission practices look like is not, you got two students from the same school. One of them is white, one of them is black, and they've done all of the exact same things. We're going to take the black student, right? Like that's not actually what it is. It's not two students who've done the exact same thing. One is Asian, and they've got the same test scores. We're not taking the Asian student, we're going to take the other. That actually the practice of admission in these institutions is so much more nuanced that decisions are typically not black and white in that case. I like that, that was not on purpose. And so I think that what we really hope to do is dispel the myth in our work and disseminate down that it is that these conversations are not simple. We want them to be simple because we believe culturally that if you do X and strive for Y, then you will have Z as your outcome. And unfortunately, that's not how these things work. And that there's a real nuance to this process. And that attacking race is really to attack the coded language that exists behind what we do when we attack race. And that the meritocracy of the system, and so we want to put together a couple of pieces of reading for you. And there's a couple of books that I know pop into mind that have helped me better understand this. And meritocracy as it's perceived is not just grades plus tests equals accept. Our system was never designed in that way. If it were, our school systems would be equitable, and they're not. So that's sort of how I'm processing some of this, and I know that's some of what we've talked about over in our conversations. And I think I've spoken enough, but we wanted to give some time for folks to ask questions, and I'll pass the mic over to Emily and Jason.
John one.
So you know Carolina was named in that suit, and we had a meeting on campus. This was kind of in early June, and it was the general counsel and his team who were arguing beforehand. They said, hey, the decision's going to come out. It's going to be on a Thursday at 10 o'clock. We don't know which Thursday, and sure enough, it was Thursday at 10 o'clock. And just sort of providing inside, perspective of what that meeting was like, and bringing up a couple points. One of the things they said very clearly is, because they knew this was not going to rule in Carolina's favor, they knew that. And so, the tagline we've been saying is that this doesn't actually change our core values, right? That particular decision. They're still trying to sort of unpack, the legal team, what the implications are of that ruling. When we were in there, there were a couple things that he really hit home, because we were all being asked to go back to our different applications for coming into the university, but also within the university you have intra-university transfers, right? And those often have applications. So we're all scouring through that. And it was very clear that you cannot use proxy measures, right? In fact, that language is in the ruling. And so even that question from Sarah Lawrence, now that wouldn't fly to public university in a fairly, though we're turning purple, but still conservative state, that would probably be challenged, right? And so the proxy measure piece, I think they're going to have a real spotlight on, and people are going to challenge different ways of doing that. Now, UNC then came out and said it was actually 80,000. Any student whose cumulative family income is 80,000, under 80, goes for free, right? And that's for in-state students, because 80% of our student population, actually more than that, is in-state. When the lawyers were describing it, and this is what I wanted to pick up on, was there were sort of two dimensions to the claim. So the first one was all about using race in the admissions process. And then the second claim was really based on the 14th Amendment, ironically, that all things in higher education would have to be colorblind, right? And so, and that's actually where because we all had decided in the room, like, okay, we know how to blind the race factor of this. We're accepting the fact that we're not going to be able to use that in admissions. We'll encourage rich essays, right? But then what we really perseverated on was the second half of that claim, right? Which is that based on the 14th Amendment, equal protection of law actually created after the Civil War, right? What they were pushing for is all things in higher ed to be colorblind, which had implications for pipeline programs, scholarships that are aimed for certain populations, and then hiring, right down to research, and what we can do with federal funding, because we're hugely funded by NIH grants, right? And so that's sort of my question to you is, like, we focused on admissions, but then how much more is this going to spread? Because, where I worked at the med school, where I work now in data science, we have pipeline programs purposefully. Are those then going to be under attack in addition to those scholarships? Like, how far do you think this is going to go? And to be honest, I think the lawyers are still unpacking the ruling to figure out that answer, but I'm curious what your thoughts are.
So I can, is this off?
Just that.
Is that great?
Oh, you can,
No, I'm speaking of microphone. It's a nicer effect.
awesome.
Yeah, before we go along.
Oh, awesome. Okay, so.
You got the microphone.
Awesome, thank you. So to your point, I think all of the questions that you just posed are questions that we're currently discussing with our general counsel at Tufts. So I think that a lot of universities are figuring this out right now. So I joined Tufts on October 31st of 2022. Does anyone know the significance of that date? It's Halloween, but something else. No. So that's when the oral arguments began for the current case that we're discussing. And we have been in, Okay, yeah, so we've been in monthly meetings since last November with our general counsel team and other stakeholders preparing for, this verdict, right? So there have been many questions that have been answered. I think Chris covered some of that, and also many of the questions that you just posed are still kind of question marks. So I think that, we're still waiting for guidance from the Department of Education, et cetera. So I think that over the next, hopefully not few months, but maybe like, weeks, et cetera, there should be more clarification around those questions.
It's just a point, it's something I worry about, right?
Absolutely.
Can I just build on that for a second, and then I'll back right off. So that second part is where, for instance, in philanthropy, using I statements here, I'll say that implication for all sectors and the idea of economic mobility, the pathway to economic mobility is well established as being more accessible to college graduates. And that for philanthropy is the biggest concern. In many ways, the largest concern about the effects outside of how higher education admission ends up working. And I'll just preview that there's a lot of conversation in major philanthropy that, one, cares about education, but also cares about all other, essentially, like rights of democracy and the possibility of creating a more pluralistic future that's economically inclusive and more level. Fundamentally, the inequality equation that's coming out of this, using the 14th Amendment implications, is what has a ripple effect outside of the specific practices of admission. So I'm happy to, one thing I could contribute is there's an interesting, a number of strong opinions and well-stated arguments from philanthropic leaders that I can share with the team if you'd like to look at those in reading materials that come out of this. The last thing I'll just sort of plug in there is that many of the philanthropy leaders that co-signed an open letter in response to this, their grantee partners, most of whom you would probably be familiar with in your region as working in all sorts of on all sorts of important issues, including even in the arts, where I can comment a little more directly, are immediately after this ruling, as associated with their foundation support or their own explicit policies, the nonprofits that have policies or programs designed around changing resource allocation towards specific identity targets, BIPOC communities, low-income families, saw an immediate uptick in intimidation and harassment that came in a much more organized fashion. In other words, the sort of the latent legal and social effort that has been building to oppose the outcome of this, not just in higher education, but in the community, was triggered. Essentially, as soon as this ruling came down, as soon as philanthropy started speaking up, grantee partners across the United States saw an immediate uptick in organized opposition and intimidation. So it has a lot of implications in terms of how practice hits the ground for social change.
Okay, Dr. Mack.
Really quickly, I want to answer Joanna's question directly. Are there going to be more lawsuits? Yes.
Yeah.
And institutions are going to they're going to engage in risk calculus, right? They're going to figure out what's worth taking chances. And that enables the organizations that Mac just referenced. But we've got a room full of people who care about quality education for all, and we cannot be deterred. In fact, we should be emboldened to counter the initiatives of those who don't want equitable education. Right? There are people who benefit from inequity. Right? For them, it is a feature and not a bug. And so it is our job, the people in this room, who I've come to really appreciate even more over the last 3 days. It is our job to continue and to be more vigorous and more intentional in our work.
Just at a practical level, though, right? I mean, just, because the university cares about name and reputation, and obviously they don't want to be a repeat attack. You know, they don't want to see that. They don't want to see the headlines, and so what is the, you know, so admission period starts now, right? Like applications, early decision, whatever, it's November. So what is kind of like the immediate game plan now? So like I get the institutional priorities, but it, you know, because in the application you still have to pick off the rates. So you know you check it off, but are they, so is you know, do you not look at it?
No, so practically, that's actually what we were talking about. So, you know, UNC uses Common App, right? So, I mean, we'd already sort of figured out that that is a regular question on the Common App, right? And in other states, that's perfectly fine to mark that. We had already figured out how to withhold that information, but then move the rest of the information forward for consideration, right? One of the things that we do know is that once students are admitted, of course, we can track diversity metrics. And for accreditation, there's accreditation implications actually too. I'll say this, you know. But that was also the center of our conversation is you're going to see this drop and you need to start measuring that too. What we won't be able to measure is how many students then self-selected out of even thinking like, I'm not a Carolina student, right? So your pool just the pool of applicants is going to change based on this. And we won't be able to measure that difference, right? We'll be able to measure once people are admitted compared to prior years of admission, you know, demographics. But what we did talk about was our essay prompt is not very targeted like Sarah Lawrence's, right? But I do think what you'll see is lots more students putting in there very clearly the group, the community, their lived experience in that, and that will be more heavily considered. Now, I would say UNC didn't hit the the ACT piece as hard as the written essay and your actual cumulative experience of well-roundedness, right? And GPA was a greater factor, actually. But practically, that's getting blinded. It's getting withheld, and the IT folks are behind that.
Actually going to be blinded.
Yeah, it's going to be blinded. Like the information's in there because the Common App's actually used in many states, right?
Yeah.
Right.
Every state.
Right. And so we had already worked with IT to figure out how to withhold that information, but move everything else forward, right? And then we had to think about once they are admitted, how do we get that information back so we can begin measuring the change?
Yeah.